Excellent. So you're done.
I'm done.
Excellent.
I can stop sharing.
Your 20-minute talk has only lasted 40 minutes,
Oh, that's good by our standards.
which is excellent.
I've stopped sharing.
Okay, we're waiting for Dawn to stop sharing. Excellent.
There you go.
So I think I'll go straight into mine, which is less chatty because I'm rudely taking the chance to redo a conference presentation I did just on the way that human impacts and politics have affected the chalky reef around Norfolk, unfortunately. And I'm going to try and do this really fast at conference speed. So if you've got any questions, save them to the end, and we can go over those no problem at all. The third talk is, I think, somewhat more relaxed. It's just about the front on of a particular site. So if you haven't been to Norfolk, we can say it's one of the most characteristic sites and makes an excellent place to start. And if you have been, you can see whether you've seen all the different fragments of that front or whether you've seen more and can let us know something too. Okay, so I gave this at our McNag conference in August. Um, as well as Sea Search East, we're also McNag, Marine Conservation Action Group, Marine Conservation for Norfolk, and we'd love your support. So if you feel like joining in, can offer any help, we'd be very glad of that. So unnatural features, because we're always looking at natural features, right? And the breaking them is bad, obviously. For many years, we've considered the sites differ off Norfolk because of the chalk forms they present, and we thought that was their character. But it's very often the result of human impacts. So even an area like this, which looks rocky and natural, is the result of sort of behaviours and impacts around it. We see what's left. So the natural processes to deposit the chalk kind of packed up around 60 million years ago. And that was dinosaur times. So proper dinosaurs, and then boom. And the atmosphere changed somewhat. That the fact that that stuff is still here after 65 million years suggested that many natural processes are really quite slow. And so most natural surface features locally are the result of ice age processes acting on those Cretaceous era deposits. And the ice age processes are woolly animals. So you get your terrifying big leathery animals, and now you're into woolly animal time. And again, if you can still see those features after 11,500 years, you can see that natural processes influencing formations are really slow. And this, for example, has just been slowly worked away. But when we've talked to people like the EIFCA, they'll say of their ROV footage, we've noticed there's a white band at the base of the chalk. What's causing that? And you say, well, these people know very, very little about marine behaviours. This is scouring from the natural movement of sediment. So noticeable change while we've been diving, 25 years now, is mostly man-made. Sudden natural change isn't likely. And this is the angle that the agencies are trying to play, that, well, how do you tell? How can you tell whether it's man-made or natural impacts? And they are surprised that there might be human impacts that you could observe. And this defence is very much the Boris Johnson defence, that they simply didn't know. And the EIFCA it's their one job. They're employed to know. And I should note that apparently it's my fault that people didn't know, according to fishing news, because they could have looked, but I looked and I didn't realise what was happening. And what we see on dives is the signs, the impacts, the interactions and abrasions that have been left by fishing gear. So a little square ledge left here. And so the truth is really simpler than me knowing and not telling anyone for several hundred years, is that no one realized until it was nearly too late what would have been an enormous area of dramatic chalk is now much reduced. And that my evidence isn't an attack, it's a chance to address this, because if people value it now, then wouldn't it be good to keep it? Unfortunately, we are very nearly too late because the proportion of the original chalk left is extremely small and declining. It was always easy to assume that the chalk was in a natural state. Oops. Oh, I'm trying to move my menu bar around. Oh, God. It was always easy to assume that chalk was in a natural state, and everybody said potting was traditional. I can't get that popped up little screen at the bottom. You're not seeing that, are you?
No.
I'm being confused by a thing you couldn't see. Don't worry. Let me try this one again. It was always easy to assume that the chalk was in a natural state because everybody said potting was traditional and caused no harm, and they were really confident. And as a newcomer to the area, I kind of assumed that was the case. But in the event, nobody had actually checked. And revisiting places you notice changes. So things like the arrival of litter, the erosion of paths, loss of cover, missing wildlife and damage, a cumulative change of character. Oh, I've got my little pop-up screen out the way. And when that kind of thing occurs on the surface, it causes absolute outrage. Nobody would defend this kind of thing. But underwater, the North Sea has been thought of as a purely industrial resource, and neither industry or agency is monitoring change here underwater. The industry, not at all. The agencies might sometimes opt to do a snapshot, but as per Dawn's last talk, a snapshot only tells you what something is like at that very moment. It conceals trends, it can flatter or alarm, and it's not an accurate way of monitoring. Kept out of sight is kept out of mind, and that's the political mood. So our EIFCA, our Inshores, Fisheries and Conservation Authority, wants to be the arbiter of change and whether it matters, but they have no experience watching it. And both for them and industry, there's a vested interest in ignorance, because having to act might cost money. Somebody might miss targets for budgets. And on the other hand, industry don't want to change because that might move them somewhere else. They might have to invest in different techniques, improve their gear, even basically take an interest. So they try to argue the basics of the situation, that chalk is obviously soft and fragile. Hitting it with heavy things will break it, and abrading it will wear it away. And these broken features won't grow back. I think it's negligent to slowly investigate on a very small scale whether long-term, large-scale, accelerating damage exists. And we have proof of that. You can see it retreating over the course of years. This area has been processed by heavy fishing gear for 140 years. That's when pots started becoming available. So you could make some wild, easy assumptions that even if a pot only chipped off a tiny piece of chalk on each drop and recovery, that's a lot of chips. And when I say pot, that could be called a creel or a cage. There's all kinds of words for these things. But if you do some fairly rough maths, say 140 years, 365 days, 30 boats, and that's based on a long out-of-date piece of data. 150 pots, once for dropping, once for recovering. That's about 500 million chips based on some very, very flaky maths. And it's not just chips. Areas are smashed to pieces and ground down. Currently, the fishing authority doesn't know how many boats or pots work the reef. Um, Natural England, our statutory nature conservation body, said it could be 10,000 pots, but because the fishing authority ceased recording boats and pots some time ago, they don't know. Natural England advised that it should no longer be called a small fishery because of its intensity on the area. And to call them chips is naive. This is kind of optimistic, kind of the disingenuous, biased, and invested way to describe these things, because it can be big chunks, it can be chips, it can be big chunks, and damage on a scale is normal with every drop and every recovery on the rugged chalk. The EIFCA themselves showed this with their nauseating ROV footage a couple of years ago. And it can vary from being pretty light to ploughing down walls. Looking at this sort of gouge in the chalk, we think this is a recovery, probably of one of the anchors that sort of locates and stays the end of a line of pots, but perhaps just a pot has caught under an edge and then been used by a boat to be pulled up. And the pots on their own are pretty heavy, but they are deployed in strings that are 300 to 700 meters long. And so an empty string of pots weighs a quarter to more than half a ton dry, and much heavier when full and wet. And those are dropped and pulled into place by boats that weigh upwards of 2 tons. Some of the boats weigh close to 10 tons. And there are different techniques and different sort of favoured mechanisms, but the most fashionable is that the string is pulled into engagement with the chalk to keep the ropes taut and prevent tangling. And so those have to be pulled out of engagement with the chalk to be recovered. Bizarrely, when we spoke to them earlier this year, the EIFCA had not considered that technique or boat mass could have an effect. And the head of the EIFCA literally said out loud, I would have thought somebody in a sensitive public position would not have said, I had not thought of that, when we met him this year. And as far as I can see, he's not thought about it anymore either. Mm-hmm. Live fishing gear doesn't work every day. So my figures are only an estimate. They're just a finger in the air kind of estimate to allow discussion. However, lost, stored or abandoned gear does. It fishes every day from point of loss to the point where it is recovered on a beach. And if it doesn't wash in, it stays until it's broken down. And no one knows how much of this gear is lost off Norfolk. Beach cleans give the only indication we have. So lost strings can become a rolling, tangled chalk mill, moved by wave and tide. The ropes on them have considerable windage, and the 25-meter length of rope between pots can generate 20 to 25 kilos of lift in a typical tide before heavy sea conditions add extra energy. So these things move, and move quite dramatically. That can bring them into combination, and they will act together as they break up. And still, no one knows how many of these ghost pots still work the reef, and for how long. And in lieu of absolute science, my estimates would say that maybe 2% per annum is lost. And I've seen pots underwater for more than 10 years in the same place. We don't recover ones that have been naturalized and heavily colonized by animals. And that would suggest, 450 to 1,000 ghost pots remain in the sea on a rolling basis. A couple of years ago, volunteers, very brave volunteers, found 61 pots from Overstrand Beach. And if that were representative, the loss figure would be 5 to 10 times worse. And whole strings are regularly abandoned. Fishermen go out of business or simply leave stuff at sea. These things don't cost them enough that they have to be brought in. So, is that all? Does this just result in some broken chalk? Here's some ugly broken chalk. It doesn't. It's not just the chalk. It starts off a sequence of events. A loss of features and habitat complexity, which is officially a bad thing according to Natural England, report published late last year. It destroys the resident live wildlife. It starts the mobility of chalk mass and freed flints. And that hastens rubble production, and that creates a new and barren scour. So the loss of features, a lot of that's down to rope, where raised features are cut short. We're not in a granite area, and the chalk is soft enough to be cut like cheese with a wire. Extended features can be divided. Pots can be pulled through chalk walls, and once a feature is divided, it is much less resilient and can be knocked down by drag lines of pots, swinging pots, or mobile lost pots. This obviously results in a loss of wildlife. On raised surfaces where things would normally flourish, we see less biodiversity. We see areas completely dominated by fast-growing algae rather than being a typical animal turf you might see in other areas. Niches and capacity for wildlife disappear, and so the diversity falls. The authority likes to measure crabs. Crabs only measures industrial productivity. They don't measure biodiversity, because crabs will happily eat sewage. Crabs are not not a gourmet measure of a high diversity system. They're almost the reverse. Once things are broken down, you have mobile chalk and you enter a rubble cycle, where chalk is light and fragile. It moves and breaks easily. It becomes smaller and more mobile, and it acts as an abrasive mulch. It clears surface life, and then it itself disappears, ground to powder and washed away. Natural erosion is is gradual and even, whereas sort of the impacts of sort of chalk or pot on chalk are sharp and hard. So these chunks are abrasive, angular pieces that are then worked into the natural sort of tidal movement of material. As well as the chalk, you have freed flints, and flint is tough, hard and heavy. It's included within the chalk naturally, and big flints are stable. So we often see barren areas where the big flints are the islands of wildlife settlement. They are the hosts to fauna because the fauna can persist, whereas the lower chalk plain is polished as small mobile flints that have also been broken away are pushed inshore. And that leads us to a barren, scoured seabed, which becomes a swept plain. It's much less diverse. It can support many fewer species. It's open to sediment flows. The raised chalk rises above the flows of normal sediments like sand, fine gravel, and even massive quantities of worm tubes seems to be a characteristic one. And so the seabed is lowered. It's open to sediment flows and prone to inundation, where exposed seabed is lost. And that's what a scoured piece of chalk looks like. It's absolutely horrendous, and it is not a natural feature. This is feature extinction. The progression turns a diverse, raised, complex seabed into a limited capacity, low, scoured plain. This kind of stuff. So quick three case studies of these things. Sheringham is a remnant area of high chalk under a lot of pressure. Cromer is an epicenter of rubble, and Overstrand is where those feature extinction pictures come from. Sheringham is the last area to have long, relatively unbroken gullies, but the highest pot density is focused here. The features are retreating towards the shore. It's hard to break the lower start of the gullies inshore, easier to snap off the taller ends offshore, and so they are being chased in by fishing. The low undulating chalk beyond isn't a natural feature. It is the remains of the gullies levelled down and are being averaged to a plane. And increasingly we see a pavement of flint cobble, where flint dropping from the chalk is laying over the top, left in place, and is starting to accrete. It's a different kind of habitat, but again, we don't think it forms naturally. If you have time, and you can ask me later, you can have a look online. That QR code would take you to this, which is a dive comparison of DEFRA, government bathymetry, from sometime between 2011 and 2017, and a dive in 2022. And in those 5 to 11 years, you can see that instead of crossing gullies, you're starting to just cross an undulating plain with a lot of rubble. In Cromer, we already see reduced diversity. Rubble inundation can make up to 3/4 of the exposed seabed in places, where remaining features are surrounded by this rubble, and it washes into shore. So we see rubble, all the way to the shore, where it is being used as a mulch, an abrasive mulch across the intervening seabed. And if it's angular, we know it's the result of recent activity. It is the inwash from fishing. So that's what a lot of fine rubble looks like. Cromer West was something that struck us, that's starker. It has even lower complexity, reduced definition in its undulations, flint boulders all the way to shore. They've been freed long enough to move. And this appears to be from historic activity, because the rubble has mostly dissipated. We're seeing isolated flints and fairly barren chalk. This kind of stuff, very strange to see when Sheringham nearby is densely covered in verdant material during the summer. Overstrand was the key site where we realized what was happening, that it had become a plain scoured seabed, and the angular features left as stumps were a clue, because again, natural features would be cyclical. They wouldn't be angular. Human features would be angular, since the fishing runs with the tide east-west along the coast. There's very little encrusting life left, except on large, static flint boulders. And here we have a few remnants of raised chalk. And it won't have been deposited like that. It could never be deposited like that. But this is what's left. And you're seeing sort of a low dirt of algae and sediment, and a few big flints knocking around. There's Dawn diving along some big flints, and these are really big flints. They are a metre, or just over a washing machine wide, and they are the things that host sponges, squirts, algae on top, and they're packed with tunnels. They have little fish in. They're a substitute habitat, but they are a tiny subset of the area and the diversity that this area used to have. So if you are going to take away some thoughts, I think history tells us how we got here, and efforts by the authorities are to see, well, what is it now? And we really need to understand a history so we can change what we're doing rather than decide that over the course of a day or two, nothing much is happening. So the damage needs context, and a slow, narrow trial will miss the point. A holistic understanding is needed here, and connected systems are at work. And very literally, I've hardly touched on how damaging the rope is in these systems. The rope does the heavy lifting of leveling chalk. So fishing inwash degrades the reef, the inwash of broken material. Fishing not only inflicts this initial impact damage, it then causes the natural damage that industry is focusing on and tries to highlight when they see rocks left on the beach. They freed those, and it is their work that is being manifest on the beach. So that was horribly disappointing and depressing. But if we can motivate you and people like you, we can perhaps do something about this before there's a disastrous loss of habitat.